to my channel. First, let me apologize for all the background noise you're probably going to hear. My 3D printer is running and I totally didn't think about the fact that I wanted to record this video before I started it. I will do my best to edit out as much of the noise as I can, but there's probably still going to be some background noise that I just can't get rid of. So today I'm going to walk you through how I made my 1880s inspired Aurora bodice. So if that's something you're interested in, make sure that you hit the subscribe button because I love posting videos like this as well as updates on my cosplay progress throughout the year and some competition behind the scenes. I have a guesting spot coming up that I'm going to do some videos around as well. So if that all sounds great to you, make sure you hit the subscribe button. If you like this video, make sure you hit the like button, comment your thoughts down below, and let's hop on into it. So here's the pattern we're going to use. This is by Truly Victorian and it's the TV467 pattern for an 1886 evening bodice. This pattern has some unique features. There's some pleating along the shoulder and front that then gets hidden behind a built-in vest at the waist. It also has this cute little bow detail in the back and the sleeves wrap around to the top. And at least in this picture, it is tied by a little bow. One thing I want to note is that it is extremely important to follow the instructions to the letter on taking your measurements. Historical patterns are very different than modern patterns, and Truly Victorian has this neat little setup so that you can get a customized fit to your project. But in particular with these patterns, just because you say fall into size E on one pattern piece does not mean you will be a size E on another pattern piece. So read through the instructions, take your measurements, and follow the guide on the second page so that you can make sure you get the best fit. Oh, and let me show you my fabric. So this is the fabric I'm using. It's jacquard, I think, or some form of brocade. I'm not certain, but it is woven. It has this beautiful pink and blue color shift to give that Sleeping Beauty vibe. And it is on this very slick black backing. This stuff is kind of a nightmare to work with. It will fray if you just look at it. So I'm going to cut out the pieces as I need them and then immediately serge them or fray check them to try and control this fraying. So the first steps are to cut out your pattern pieces and then flatline them against the inner lining. So I'm using a mid-weight canvas as my inner lining to give it some structure and stability. And I chose not to flatline at first. I thought that I could just serge the edges together and that would hold everything in place, but I actually highly recommend flatlining the fashion fabric to the inner facing to keep it from slipping around and avoiding these little bubbles that I got on this piece. First thing we're going to do is work on the front of the bodice. So the front has a piece called the front, it has a piece called the overfront, and it has a piece called the vest. All three layers get stitched on top of each other, with the front being the bottom, the overfront being the top, the middle, and the vest being the top. So first thing we're going to do is I'm going to prep the darts for my overfront. And I do this simply by cutting out the dart from the pattern piece and then tracing it onto my piece with an iron erasable or heat erasable pen. And then I use a ruler to draw down the middle from the tip to the bottom of the dart, and that will be my fold line later when I go to stitch these darts in place. Next, we're going to take our overfront and we're going to fold in the front edge to the wrong side 1 inch and press in place. So I'm actually skipping around on the instructions here. I found some advice online on how to make the front part of this a little easier. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm skipping adding the gathering stitches to the bottom inner part as it would interfere with the pleating later. I'm also skipping stitching in the side dart for the moment so that my piece can continue to lay flat on the table and make the pleating a little easier. So we're actually going to move over those steps and lay over fronts onto fronts, matching armhole side and hem, based along the armhole side and hem edges. Then we are going to move on to pleating and pleat the inner part of this piece to create the collar, using the markings on the pattern to ensure we have even pleats. So next we're going to take our vest pieces and we're going to fold the top edge to the wrong side 1/2 inch and press in place. I already did this before I recorded this part of the video, and I actually went ahead and top stitched it to keep it in place. We're going to place the vest over the front, matching the center front and hem edges. Mine, for some reason, is a little wonky. I think the fabric got misshapen when I was serging the edges, but I think that we can still make it work. So you place this on top of the front, matching the center front and hem edges as best as possible, and the top should cover up the bottom of your pleats, hiding those raw edges. It is important here to try and get the side edge to match with the center of the front dart. That didn't necessarily happen for me, but I think it's still salvageable. And then baste around the side and bottom edges of the vest to hold it in place. So this is where the fun begins. So now that we have that basted in place, I added a few extra pins to hold my pleats down. I did not like the way that these pleats were turning out in this fabric. This fabric does not like to be manipulated like that, so they're all uneven and kind of wrinkly. I was hoping that perhaps when I put it on the mannequin that the curvature would straighten that out. So I still had hope at this point that these pleats would work. So the next step is going to be to fold in our front dart. And we want to capture that left edge of the vest within that dart. So I'm going to flip it over and use the guidelines that I had drawn in place previously to fold in my dart and pin it in place. And you can see here that the top left of that vest is just not getting caught in the dart, so I continued to adjust until it was. And then stitch in place. So it was at this point that I decided I hated the pleats. So I removed the front vest. I didn't want the overfront to be an entirely different color. So to do that, cut along this fold with the plan to be that the new lapel piece will cover up the raw edge of this overfront. So I took some white satin that I already had on hand and cut it out in the shape of just the pleated part from the pattern piece. And then I folded the raw edges in and ironed them in place. And finally, I pleated the satin down to be the width of the sleeve. So at the moment, I'm happy with these new white lapel pieces. I chose white because I thought it was reminiscent of Sleeping Beauty's, the top of her gown, which has those white points. So that's why I chose white. I was kind of happy with it at this point, but I was uncertain about how stark it was against this darker fabric. But for the moment, we're just going to move forward and add the vest pieces back on and then add in our front darts as well. I don't have a video of it, but I do wind up stitching together the center fronts after the vests are in place and then stitching on the sides as well. So after you have the vest in place and the front stitched together and the side pieces stitched on, it's time to add in some boning. Follow the instructions for the length of boning and how to place the boning. It's pretty easy to follow, it's very descriptive. I just wound up hand stitching mine in place. Just ensure that your boning channels are stitched only to the seam allowance. So finishing up the back is going to be a little different than how we normally would do this with a modern pattern. So what you're going to do is take your center back pieces and stitch them at the sleeves only. And then you're going to take your side back pieces, which is the piece with the two curved points coming off and the big center rectangle, and you're going to pin this to the center back piece and stitch all this together. And at some point I remembered to put in my side darts. So if you haven't stitched in your side darts, make sure you go ahead and do that and then add the boning to the side darts. You're going to have boning on all of your seams and all of your darts. So now that we have the base bodice completely put together, the next step is going to be to pleat in the center part of that bow. So something that I did that I left off camera as well is I went ahead and bias bound all of my edges. I chose white thinking, you know, with this whole Sleeping Beauty plan that white would look nice, but it was horrible. And I actually recommend that you bias bind your edges before you have this all put together like this, particularly this back piece. My bias binding is the worst bias binding I've ever done. Like, it is absolutely horrible. Fortunately for me, I plan to cover up all of the bias with some lace and additional frills and details, so I didn't really care that much about how bad it looked, but it looked absolutely horrible. So for this back piece, make sure that you bind it before it ever reaches, before you ever stitch it onto the main part. And I also think that the front piece should be bias bound before you attach the back side pieces as well. For this back pleat, I just followed the pleat guides on the pattern, and then I stacked the pleats on top of each other, which made it really thick, but it actually sits quite nicely on the back bustle. And the way that this is going to work later is you will attach some cording to the back of this, and then it'll tie up into the lacing of your bodice, which I actually prefer to tie it up into the lacing of my corset, and that is what's going to hold that bow in place. Alright, so this is where I sort of go off the rails following this pattern. I intended this video to be a guide to help you through constructing your own pattern or your own bodice utilizing this pattern, and I do think that the steps up to this point are pretty solid and can help through any confusing parts that are within this pattern. And I know it can be extremely confusing. It confused me a lot and took me some time to decipher, so I'm happy to share what I learned with you. I wound up deciding that I absolutely hated the pleats altogether. I hated the pleats altogether, and I wound up taking it apart again and redoing most of the front. So if you follow these steps that I've done so far and then follow the rest of the instructions, they're pretty clear, and you'll be able to finish this bodice and make it look like what you see on the front of the pattern. The sleeve instructions are pretty simple and straightforward. There was nothing really to decipher there. Everything from this point on was pretty easy. But I want to walk you through what I did to change it up a little bit. And I'll pop up some video around me and some photos around me to show the end result. I wound up not recording anything of the construction because I was so focused on figuring out what I wanted to do that I just didn't even think about it. So all I wound up doing was removing the overfront altogether. So I took the front of the bodice apart, removed the white pleated lapel, and removed the overfront altogether, and removed the vest. I stitched the darts back into the front panel pieces and then stitched the center front together, so now it's only one layer. I added the boning back in place, and I actually had to take it in the back a little bit, so I did a little adjusting there, and I wound up leaving the boning off of the curved seams and back. The fabric was thick enough at that point that it kind of acted as its own boning, and it seems to be fine, so I left it like that. I then added some 3D flower and pearl lace around the bottom, hiding that absolutely horrendous bias binding that I did, and added some additional lace around the back bow part that was not that 3D flower. The 3D flower just didn't work for the back bow, and I just hand stitched all of that in place. And then for the top part, I just played around with it and wound up finding some white lace that I had on hand, and I pleated it all around the top and hand stitched that in place. It's more reminiscent of like 1860s, I think, but this build is inspired by history, so it doesn't have to be perfectly accurate. So I went ahead and stitched that in place, and then added some additional pearl trim on top of that for some added glam. And then the sleeves I created out of white taffeta, which matches the white overskirt, adding some pearl detailing around that. I will tell you, I did change the sleeve just slightly. I shifted it a little to the front so that that overlap hangs over the front a little bit more, so that you can see more of that pearl detailing when you're looking straight on someone. So rather than having it all gathered at the top, I just took it and shifted it just a little bit more. So I will plug up a video somewhere around here of the whole outfit. I don't have the wig yet or the jewelry yet, so I'll have to take video of that when I'm at MomoCon. But that is it for building this bodice. If you haven't seen my videos on how I made the overskirt and how I made the underskirt, I'll put them up in the cards and I'll put them down in the description, so make sure to check those out. And I hope these videos help you in your next build, and I will see you in my next video. Bye!